opening the central diagonal immediately, aiming for quick development and control of key squares. Prepares a fianchetto, eyeing the long diagonal but neglecting central space. Solidifying central control, d4 immediately challenges black's fianchettoed bishop and opens diagonals for white's pieces. Unleashing the fianchettoed bishop, this develops a potent attacking piece aiming at white's central grip. Developing knights now reinforces the center and prepares castling, building a solid foundation for future action. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside development, this maintains flexibility. Developing the bishop to this square establishes a classic fianchetto setup, aiming for queenside pressure and potentially supporting a central pawn push. Developing the knight mirrors white's development and prepares for castling, aiming for piece harmony and king safety. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, immediately securing the king and preparing to activate remaining pieces. Anchoring the king safely behind pawns prepares for central maneuvering and avoids early queenside exposure. Positioning a rook on the e-file prepares a potential central pawn push and aims to support it, while also creating a more active role for the rook should the e-file open further, adding pressure to black's kingside. Developing the knight to c6 here is a natural developing sequence, bolstering the center and preparing to contest the d4 pawn, but it also subtly invites a bit of central skirmishing, potentially leading to a more open game than black might prefer given white's solid pawn structure. This pawn thrust immediately disrupts black's central pawn structure, forcing a decision on how to react to the encroaching pawn chain, potentially creating weaknesses on the light squares around the king if not handled precisely. Pressuring white's d5 pawn, the knight boldly ventures forward, seeking to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses on the queen side, while simultaneously opening lines for potential piece activity on that flank. The bishop retreats, relinquishing the diagonal but reinforcing the king side, a pragmatic choice as the knight on b4 probes deeper, forcing a positional concession to avoid material loss. Unpinning the knight from the queen is a sound idea, aiming to redistribute black's pieces and potentially prepare for a central pawn push. However, it somewhat neglects the growing pressure on white's queenside, and that bishop now finds itself in a more passive position, potentially becoming a target for white's attacking endeavors. Securing the knight, this maneuver prepares to reinforce the center and potentially launch a kingside attack, while simultaneously offering a retreat for the bishop should it become pressured. Asserting queenside space is the primary objective here, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially prepare a queenside expansion or pawn break. This maneuver challenges the well-placed bishop and jockey for a more active position. Challenging the bishop's influence, this advance prepares to dislodge the knight and gain breathing room on the kingside, potentially opening avenues for future queenside expansion. Shifting the bishop away from the h3 pawns, pressure strategically repositions the piece for future action, potentially supporting a queenside pawn advance or preparing for a central pawn break. Striking at the pawn chain, white initiates a central pawn thrust, aiming to dislodge the knight and gain space. This aggressive stride forces black to immediately decide on the fate of their advanced knight, potentially creating weaknesses if not handled with precision. The knight repositions, seeking a more active post on the queen side, potentially aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and influence the b4 square, though this maneuver sacrifices immediate central influence for long-term pressure. Repositioning the knight to b3 is a thoughtful maneuver, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and potentially reroute the knight towards c5, exerting pressure on black's queenside structure. This aims to create a more harmonious development and exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's knight on a6. Instigating a queenside pawn race, this advance immediately challenges white's advanced knight and forces a decision regarding the space advantage on this flank. Seeking to unravel black's queenside expansion, white repositions a knight to a more active central outpost, aiming to control key diagonals and potentially prepare a kingside attack or a pawn breakthrough later. Unlocking the knight's potential requires careful maneuvering, and this placement aims to disrupt white's central control by attacking the c3 pawn, a key piece in white's pawn chain. It also opens avenues for the b7 pawn to advance, potentially threatening white's queenside structure and creating more space for black's pieces to operate. Sharpening the central spearhead, white reinforces the advanced knight and prepares a potential kingside advance, aiming to restrict black's queenside mobility. Challenging the center with a pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's firmly established pawn chain and create dynamic counterplay. Analysis of 14, c6*. This move is a bold and active response, seeking to break free from the positional constraints imposed by white's central pawns. Black is essentially saying, "You've built a strong pawn center, but I intend to challenge it and open lines for my pieces." Strategic ideas behind the move, ***. Challenging the center, ***. The primary goal is to attack white's d4 pawn, which is the linchpin of white's central control. By pushing the c-pawn, black initiates a pawn battle that could lead to the opening of lines, particularly the c-file. Creating space, ***. Advancing the c-pawn also helps black to gain a bit more space on the queenside. This can be crucial for maneuvering pieces and potentially creating attacking chances. Opening lines for queenside play, ***. If white captures on c6, dxc6, black can recapture with dxc6, opening the d-file and potentially activating the queen and other pieces. Even if white doesn't capture, the pawn advance itself can prepare for future queenside operations. Potential for tactical opportunities. Pawn breaks often lead to tactical complications. Black might be anticipating a response from white that could create weaknesses or open up lines for tactical sequences. Potential downsides and considerations, ***. Weakening the queenside pawn structure. Advancing the c-pawn can create a backward pawn on d6 if dxc6 is met by dxc6. This could become a target for white later. Giving up central influence, ***. Black is willingly entering into a pawn exchange, which can sometimes lead to a simplification of the position. Black needs to ensure they are not left with a passive position after the exchange. Requires precise follow-up, ***. This move is not a standalone solution. Black will need to follow up with energetic piece play to capitalize on the opened lines and potential weaknesses. Overall, 14, c6 is a fighting move that injects dynamism into the position. It's a commitment to active play and an attempt to seize the initiative. Finally, the pawn on d5, a central anchor, is exchanged, resolving some of the positional knotting and potentially opening lines that have been suffocating the queenside. Black's recapture on c6 undeniably opens lines for the rooks and the queen, but it creates a permanent weakness on d6 that white will surely eye for exploitation. This pawn structure shift significantly alters the pawn dynamics of the center, potentially leading to a more open game where piece activity and tactical awareness will be paramount. Unleashing a pawn spear, white immediately seeks to disrupt black's cramped queenside and gain attacking initiative, sacrificing a pawn for dynamic compensation. This aggressive thrust forces black to confront immediate tactical possibilities and strategic decisions regarding pawn structure and king safety, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. The knight's journey to d5 strategically shores up the queenside and introduces potential complications around white's central pawns. Notice how it now directly influences the d4 square, creating a pawn chain that might prove troublesome for white to break down without concessions. Unlocking the center after black's pawn sacrifice, white embraces the opportunity to destabilize the enemy pawn structure and potentially seize an open file. Opening the d-file now grants your opponent a temporary pathway, but strategically, it opens up the center for potential long-term pressure and creates opportunities to reevaluate piece placement. The bishop now eyes the black queen, potentially disrupting coordination and forcing a decision about its placement. Exploring the tactical intricacies, this maneuver aims to activate the queen into the center, potentially creating pressure along the b-file and offering support for advances. Alternatively, consider the positional implications of this queen relocation. It reroutes the monarch from its initial defensive posture, seeking to exploit weaknesses that white's pawn structure might have created after the recent exchanges. From a dynamic standpoint, the queen's new outpost on b6 injects immediate tension, forcing white to address potential threats and perhaps abandon some of their positional plans in favor of immediate defense. Furthermore, observe how this move subtly challenges white's pawn chain on the queen side. The queen's presence might encourage black to consider pawn breaks or tactical sequences that leverage this new influence. Centralizing the rook on the d-file immediately asserts dominance over the open file, preparing to contest its control and potentially infiltrate black's position. Black reinforces the central pawn chain and prepares to contest the open e-file, aiming to activate the rook and create counterplay against white's somewhat exposed king. Recentering the knight to d2 aims to support a potential queenside pawn push and re-establish control over the critical c4 square, preventing black's pieces from finding comfortable outposts there. Exchanging the rook on the open file relinquishes central control and invites white's queen and knights to become more active in the d-file and on the queen side, potentially creating imbalances. Reclaiming the open file solidifies white's central presence, a vital step towards consolidating the extra pawn and preparing for eventual pawn advances or piece sacrifices on the king side. The knight's repositioning to e6 aims to solidify the central pawn chain and prepare for potential breaks on the king side, though it does create a temporary target on the d6 pawn. Liberating the d-file, this exchange aims to simplify the position and exploit the newly opened avenue for the rook, potentially creating threats along that important corridor. Reclaiming the bishop to its active diagonal, this recapture immediately addresses the pawn structure's newfound openness on the king side, aiming to solidify black's central presence and prevent white's knight from finding a comfortable outpost on d4. Liberating the knight to d2 was a prelude to its active redeployment, and nc4 now challenges black's queenside pawn structure and eyes the valuable c5 square. Accepting the pawn sacrifice consolidates black's central presence, subtly shifting the positional balance towards the queen side where the advanced pawns and the bishop on g7 are poised to exert pressure. This maneuver aims to relocate the knight from a somewhat passive outpost on the queen side to a more active central square, creating potential attacking avenues and bolstering the queenside pawn structure by offering support to the pawn if needed. Sensing the open lines and white's pressure, black pivots the knight, not to a passive square, but to a dynamic outpost on b6, aiming to exploit the weakened c4 square and support potential advances on the queen side, while also preparing for future counterplay by contesting control of the queenside majority. Shifting the queen to the queen's flank might seem unusual, but it prepares to contest the open files and simultaneously offers a safe haven from potential discovered attacks targeting white's king. This maneuver elegantly prepares for a pawn push on the queen side while reinforcing the central pawn chain. Preparing for the upcoming queenside initiative, the rook tucks itself away on the b-file, aiming to support the pawn's advance and potentially contest the open file should it become available. Initiating the rook to the d-file, white seeks to establish central control and prepare for potential pressure along that open file. Sensing a dangerous kingside exposure, black proactively shores up the defensive perimeter around their monarch, aiming to neutralize white's increasingly aggressive central pawn structure and potential attacking avenues. Repositioning the bishop to a more active square, the aim is to eye the queenside and potentially support a pawn push, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the central tension that has developed. Safeguarding the monarch from potential diagonal threats, while preparing for a potential repositioning of the bishop. Focusing on fortifying the king side, the queen repositions, preparing for potential pawn pushes and reinforcing the knight's defensive posture by offering a more robust escort. This maneuver, bringing the knight back to the center, seeks to solidify black's pawn structure and potentially prepare for a d5 advance, while also offering flexibility for further development of the pieces on the queen side. Initiating a dynamic shift, the bishop relocates to pressure the queenside pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside advance by white. Unleashing a centralized knight demands immediate attention, forcing the opponent to reassess pawn structures and piece activity in the center. Re-establishing control over the central files, this redeployment prepares to challenge black's active queen and potentially disrupt its coordination, aiming to regain the initiative by putting pressure on the d-pawn. Establishing a firmer presence on the 7th rank with the rook seems intended to bolster the pawn chain and potentially prepare for future exchanges, though it simultaneously concedes central control and offers little immediate counterplay against white's burgeoning knight on a3. A bold repositioning, aiming to redeploy the knight from an exposed flank into a more central, influential square, potentially challenging black's advanced queenside pawns and offering support for future kingside advances. Shifting the queen back to the queenside offers a subtle defensive advantage, preparing to potentially reroute it to a more active square should white's central pressure abate. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain's potential, this maneuver redirects the knight to a more active outpost, eyeing the f5 square and potentially preparing a kingside attack. Securing the bishop's retreat and reinforcing the kingside dark squares, this maneuver aims to consolidate black's position while probing for potential weaknesses in white's pawn structure, particularly that isolated d-pawn. Liberating the queen's diagonal and clearing the path for the rook's potent central influence, this exchange initiates a significant positional shift. A bold sacrifice of pawn structure for immediate attacking opportunities arises as black embraces the challenge, aiming to unleash kingside pressure with their newly liberated bishop and knight pair. Refocusing the knight from its central post to a more defensive stance on e2, this redeployment appears cautious, perhaps aiming to shore up the kingside or prepare for a repositioning to a better square later, though it cedes valuable central space and allows black's pieces more freedom of action. The bishop retreats to a more passive square, surrendering the central outpost it briefly occupied and reinforcing the pawn chain, a somewhat defensive maneuver that allows white to solidify their kingside space with the upcoming repositioning of their knight. Sharpening the attack on the queen side, the queen repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs and supporting a kingside advance. Unlocking the queenside potential, this maneuver aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn pushes or aiming for tactical opportunities on the 7th rank. Consolidating pieces around the d5 square, this knight repositioning aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on the kingside, creating a more unified defense against black's active queen. Pushing the e-pawn forward creates a significant pawn chain, aiming to lock down white's queenside and potentially launch a kingside attack. Focalizing the queen onto the queenside, where activity is concentrated, signals a shift in white's strategy, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's pawn advances. Unleashing a pawn thrust on the queenside to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines, aiming to exploit the g2 diagonal and create weaknesses around the monarch. Unleashing a pawn storm's potential, this capture, while seemingly a simplification, fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn on the file and opening critical avenues for your queen and rooks to infiltrate the enemy's queenside territory. The rook's return to the 1st rank injects a surprising dose of activity, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain on the queenside and potentially open lines for counterplay. Pressing the knight to b3 aims to restrict black's queenside pawn advances and potentially prepare a knight maneuver to a stronger square, perhaps c5 to disrupt black's pawn structure. Seizing the open c-file with the bishop immediately creates a direct threat against the white king, aiming to exploit the exposed position after the pawn exchange and potentially disrupt white's coordination. Securing the d-file with the rook, white aims to challenge black's advanced pawns and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from their forward push. Unleashing the rook to challenge the queenside, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's active pieces, forcing white to address this new threat immediately. Confronting the doubled pawns on the queenside, while simultaneously creating a defensive bastion around the king, is the primary concern now. Sacrificing the queen to expose white's, king opens up a dynamic, unsettled middle game, where black aims to leverage the passed pawn and active pieces against the vulnerable monarch. Simplifying the position to an endgame, white aims to leverage the open f-file for their rook. The rook's foray to the second rank, though seemingly aggressive, opens up a potential pathway for white's knight to infiltrate the kingside, creating immediate pressure on the uncastled monarch. The knight's repositioning to the queenside aims to solidify white's pawn structure and contest the file, potentially preparing to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king as the game simplifies. The bishop, having fulfilled its defensive duties on the queenside, now ventures towards the center, aiming to join the battle for central control and potentially harass white's king if it remains exposed. Anchoring the knight on a4 aims to prevent black's rook from easily penetrating further down the b-file, while also creating a robust outpost that might later support a pawn push or a piece transfer. The bishop's repositioning aims to exploit the suddenly opened diagonal leading towards white's king, and also to contest control of the now rather passive a3 pawn.